So I'm Cara de Riviere. I'm actually a co-founder of Remote Rehab, and I'm going to be behind the scenes tonight. And we've also got Christina Bush, who's also a co-founder. She's behind the scenes. You can't see her. She's hidden away, and she's going to be looking after questions. Oh, and she's also posted in chat. So there's a notice, so you can, anybody wants any help or anything like that, just get hold of Christina in chat, and she'll be answering a few questions. But we'd ask you to ask your questions in Q&A rather than chat, and Jayne and Rachael are going to answer those at the end. So good. So we're really excited to and want to welcome Rachael Smith and Jayne Duffy, who are the creators, developers and IP holders of the Calderwell framework. And tonight, Jayne and Rachael are going to be presenting Retaining and Gaining Balance and Function. So, sorry, I made a mistake there. It's the Calderdale framework, isn't it, Jayne? Yeah, sorry. So Rachael and Jayne, I'm sort of like dry-mouthed. So Rachael and Jayne are both physiotherapists, and together they have over 50 years experience of working with patients and therapy teams. They're currently developing a new balance aid called Balance Active. So I'm going to hand you over to Jayne and Rachael. I'm just going to unpin myself and...
Hello. So I'm Rachael Smith.
I'm Jayne Duffy.
And we act as a double act.
Yes.
So we'll interject each other, no doubt, and flip between the screens. So Cara, if you want to put the presentation on, and then we'll...
I will. I'll just take a couple of moments to do that.
Nice that you're joining us, Liz.
Yeah.
That's really
I'll
exciting.
have to catch up with you later.
Definitely.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so it's Rachael speaking again. So I'll just give you a really brief potted history of my sort of physiotherapy experience. So I actually qualified as physiotherapist in 1982. So don't try and work that out too much. So I've got loads of experience, but once I'd done my basic rotations, I went to Newcastle and Manchester, came back to Bradford, and I was there to set up the rheumatology service there. And the hand service, and that was really interested in terms of seeing how older people and people with long-term conditions actually cope with their, not just their physical problems, but how it impacts on them psychologically and emotionally. Left Bradford, travelled a bit, went down to London, worked at Charing Cross Hospital with older people, and was really passionate about older people, because back in, that was about 1990, 91, they didn't get the rehab that they should, and ageism was probably behind that. Did my master's down in London, and actually studied older people in relation to muscle strength around the hip, particularly the hip abductors, and function and balance. And that was really interesting, and actually was fortunate there to work with Professor Young, who was one of the very early researchers into older people and muscle, and Dawn Skelton was actually doing her PhD when I was doing my master's down there. Came back up north after that, went to Manchester, and I actually worked in audit, so I was worked in the audit department, and that was really helpful in terms of looking at assessing clinical performance, I suppose, against standards, and the impact on patients in terms of assuring quality for patients. Moved from that back to Calderdale, to Halifax, and that was to set up an early orthopaedic discharge service, which was in 1996. And that was about trying to get orthopaedic hip and knee replacements out of hospital sooner, so they could have their rehab in a much more suitable and appropriate context, which is their home. And at that time, people were in hospital for about 14 days post hip and knee, and we were there to try and pull that down and rehab them at home. And that was really interesting, because that obviously was pushing boundaries and challenging people, but for the patients, the people who were going through that service, was far better. And it was at Rehab at Home we started to look at developing a model for delegation, and that's where the Calderdale framework started its life. So it was about making sure we were delegating appropriately, training people against competences appropriately, and putting in governance so they knew when to stop and escalate. met Jayne at Rehab at Home. She came and joined us at Rehab at Home. So that was 1999. So we've known each other a long time. And then worked in the rehab teams with Jayne. And that was very much about multidisciplinary teams and looking at developing the team as a whole team, and trying to broaden people's skill sets to make sure that we could all do more for the patient rather than bouncing patients through too many professions, if you like, and making sure the support staff there were appropriately trained. We developed a really good enablement service with social services, so patients were able to be seen fairly intensively with a tapering service, and that actually meant they didn't need ongoing home care, for example, or many fewer people ended up in long-term care. Got seconded to develop the falls pathway within Calderdale, at the same time as continuing to develop the Calderdale framework. And throughout that, sort of looking at the challenges of treating people in various settings, we started to think about developing a piece of equipment that might enable people to deliver it better rehab, I suppose, and that was Balance Active. So that's a really potted history for me.
So my turn for a potted history then. So I graduated in 1988, so nearly as long ago as Rachel, from Newcastle. My first experiences were in St James's in Leeds and Bradford teaching hospitals. And then I had a career break. So I went into business and private practice for a while. Came back into physio in about 1998. And like Rachel's mentioned, met Rachel there and was really, really fortunate to be right at the front of developing the community rehab teams. And looking at how things could be done really, really differently. And I think one of the things that we hope we're going to get across to you tonight is just because something doesn't exist now doesn't mean it can't exist in the future. And us as AHPs have got transferable skills. You know, we're amazing problem solvers, we're critical thinkers. And so it's about encouraging people to, yes, absolutely look at the evidence, but challenge the evidence and think about how we can make things better for patients. Now, just to sort of augment what Rachel said about Calderdale Framework, that's now an evidence-based workforce transformation tool used widely across the UK, Australia and New Zealand. And we were for a while known as the Calderdale Girls, but obviously time's passed since then, so it's more like the Calderdale Dowagers. But anyway, the relationship we've got between us means that we've got different strengths, and that's another thing that we want to get across tonight is about playing to your strengths. You know, nobody can be everything to everybody, but by making intelligent connections and by reflecting on where you need more assistance, then you can get some really good stuff done. So this is our journey, really. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Next slide then, please. So we'll just give you a quick frolic through the next 4 weeks of excitement. So today's an introduction or a refresher, really, about falls and balance and our clinical experience and why we decided to look at developing Balance Active. Now, what we want to do today is also explore that journey. Now, that's a really different set of skills, if you like, but like I mentioned earlier, we think that a lot of the things that we've got as therapists or health and social care workers are already inherent in our toolkit, and it's just about being brave enough to use them. So we will be talking about some of that clinical background, but also that journey, because it's been a blooming right learning curve. So then in week 2, we're going to demonstrate how to get Balance Active set up, and we're going to be including some videos of Balance Active being used in practice and the practice settings. We've had to be very pragmatic about, obviously, with COVID, but then that's given us a brilliant opportunity because it's made us think about things in a different way than we'd originally intended. So that's week 2. Then on week 3, we're excited to look forward to a discussion session. And we want to sort of pick brains and exchange ideas and where we think Balance Active might be useful, or where you almost like when people are having those placements where they're exploring what the art of the possible, really. So we want to have that kind of open and honest discussion in week 3. And then in week 4, we really are proud, actually, to share some of the person-centred case studies of how Balance Active's been used so far with patients to achieve their goals. And one of the goals from one older man, just to give you a taster, was to wash his own face stood up at a sink. Now, if you were there that moment, you'll realise why it's so important.
It's incredible
to make that things matter, that small things matter. So anyway, Rachel, Jayne, what we're doing in the 4 weeks. We best crack on.
Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, balance. What is balance? And I suppose probably this should be termed what's postural control, because humans have evolved to move. We are designed to move, but the human body is an unstable body. You know, we've got a fairly small base of support, which is our feet. We're bipedal, we're on 2 legs, we've got a relatively high centre of gravity. That makes us relatively unstable. We've got all our joints that need controlling, so it is unstable, and so it's about being able to maintain that centre of mass within the base of support whilst being able to move. And the sort of mechanisms that control posture and balance are really complex. It's a massively complex integration of sensory inputs and motor outputs, and lots of things going on in the brain. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Yes, so sensory input, so vision primarily. So the research tends to suggest 70 to 80% rely on, it's a reliance on vision, and the studies show it's often peripheral vision that's quite important. Obviously the vestibular system in the inner ear is controlling and feeding information about the position of your head in space and the acceleration and turning elements, and then proprioception coming in from joints, muscles, tendon organs, your skin, your touch, you know, as to where you are. There's really interesting studies were done early on with older people and the type of footwear they wore, because if that footwear was really soft and thick-soled, their proprioceptive inputs were massively diminished and they were really unstable. And there's now all sorts of things you can put into people's shoes to give them a better, more precise proprioceptive input. That is integrated in the brain, and there's a motor output comes out of that, and that's dependent on muscles being able to fire in the appropriate sequence with the appropriate force and power, and joint ranges of movement being there. But it also, things like emotion, how you're feeling, whether you're frightened, how alert you are will impact on that. Some of the very early studies, so there were round about in the 1980s, of people showed that it was anticipatory. So if you thought you were going to reach up for something, what they found is that prior to moving your arms, for example, the muscles in your back and in your hip extensors and in your ankles would fire to preempt wobbling over, and then the sensory inputs get sort of sorted out in your brain to see whether that needs adjusting. But if you think about watching people when they're walking on a really slippy surface like ice, you know, not only do they tense up, they lower the centre of gravity often, and they're very reluctant to actually do a normal gait. There's a much more sliding gait to keep the feet on the ground and keep the base of support big. So it is complex, and emotion and arousal does come into it. Next slide. I think the next slide is a nice picture of the brain. This is just to illustrate that some of the neuroanatomy and the areas of the brain that are involved, and it's just to show how complicated it is and the things that are going on. And that really, if you imagine for older people, for example, if any of those sensory inputs are affected, for example, visual or the proprioception, then they're not going to be able to balance as well. But equally, if you imagine somebody with a neurological problem, for example, a stroke, and they've got some damage in the brain that might affect some of those connections, that also is going to impact upon their ability to balance. And if anybody wants to know more about neuroanatomy and the sort of things that are going on in there, I think the remote rehab community would quite happily try and set up a webinar purely on that. But that was just to illustrate the complexity of what's going on. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just to show these strategies have been kind of defined from research studies, which is not in laboratories, which is not quite the same as seeing somebody in real life. But what they've found is that if you are just standing in quiet standing, and they've found this we've got people on force plates, we act as an inverted pendulum, so we're kind of rocking and swaying from the ankle. And obviously what we've then found is that older people have greater sway than younger people, and if you close your eyes, your sway is even greater, and that's just illustrating different sensory inputs that are being altered there. But when they did other studies, they identified if you put somebody on an unstable moving platform and started to shift that platform, they went into what they termed a hip strategy, which meant people were trying to catch the centre of gravity by really moving the pelvis and the hips. And again, if you think about somebody slipping on ice, that's exactly what happens. The hips go either right forward or right back. Or if you're in a position where you can't actually move your feet. So if you imagine you're on a bus and there's the bus is moving and there's a bag in front of your feet, you can't move your feet, that's where hip strategy really comes in. We're much more inclined to do a stepping type strategy if we can, and that's assuming that you've got the motor power and control to do that. So if you're losing your centre of gravity, we'll have to do a quick step forward or to the side. And it's interesting that this side step is something that often is where people fall, particularly older people, because they haven't got the speed of movement, the power to actually do that side step. They'll often do a lateral fall at that point and end up with a fractured hip potentially. And then the other strategy that is commonly used is an upper limb strategy, where you'll grab something or light touch something. And again, if you're on the tube or on a bus or something and you stood up, you'll be hanging on to those little handles to help keep your balance. And we'll use those strategies as and when we need, depending on the context of the environment we're in. So they're not necessarily so individualised. We'll utilise whichever whenever we need to. Next slide, please. Okay, so this I hope is revision for people, because this sort of evidence has been around for a long time.
Sadly not changing. And
it's not changing fast enough.
Exactly.
And older people are still, well, my experience is older people are still undertreated. So around about up to 30% of every year, this 30% of people at age 65 and over will fall. And that rises to 50% of people aged over 80 will fall each year. And then more alarmingly, over 60% of people in nursing homes fall repeatedly. In community type settings, 75% of those falls are not reported, but the impact on the people can be horrendous. So it can start to impact on their function. They can start to reduce what they do, or they have family around who say, you're going to have to be more careful. You need to do a bit less. Don't do that. Take it a bit easier, all of which is not going to help them regain muscle strength, balance, function. The knock-on of that is their quality of life is impacted, their well-being is impacted, their circle of life gets less, which means they start to restrict what they do. They see fewer and fewer people, they do less and less things, and they get into this vicious cycle of deconditioning, basically, and potentially frailty ultimately. But it also impacts on everybody in society. It's a societal problem as well, because the knock-on of that is more people need care, more people need to go into nursing homes, people's mental health is impacted, isolation is impacted, so it's affecting the whole person. And it's not normal to fall. I think it's not part of normal aging, and it's really important that we try and challenge this at every possible juncture. Next slide, please. So we know falls risk in older people increases if there are balance and gait deficits, and Timothy did some research on that a long time ago, 1990s, and identified. But they're a marker for, really, in older people, loss of muscle, which relates to inactivity. And there's been loads of research on this, and it started right down in the sort of early 1980s and has continued since then. So that's 40 years worth of research virtually that says older people, as they get older, if they remain sedentary and don't do something about it, will lose about 1% of muscle per year from around the age of 50. And that loss actually increases once you get to 80. 3%, 4% of power, and power is quite important to stop you falling. And it's fairly recently, it's now been given a nice medical term, sarcopenia. And there's been a lot of work around deconditioning and the realisation that older people, once you make them inactive, for example, in hospital, they will lose even more muscle. And given that their reserve is less, then they're going to lose muscle. But it's not only muscle that they start to lose. If they are not active and utilising their neural systems, their proprioception starts to degrade as well. And so their ability to actually balance and control the posture degrades. But the good news is it's preventable with appropriate exercise and training. It's not all negative, and I think that's really important. You know, there's loads of evidence that people who have weight trained, for example, throughout their lives retain that type 2 muscle fibre, the big muscle fibres that respond fast and with power, and they'll retain that so that they've got the same muscle as somebody who's a sedentary 30-year-old, for example. So it's not bad news, it's good news and positive. Next slide, please. So this is just this is from Dawn Skelton's research, and she was saying, you know, and it is one of the key modifiable factors for older people relating to falls, and falls can be prevented. And I know they're multifactorial, but this is one of the best modifiable risk factors that there is. So targeted, and the word there is targeted. Yeah, and it's really important that it's appropriately targeted and it's of an intensity that will make a difference. So you can regain muscle strength 8 to 12 weeks. A balance training program where somebody's practicing that skill and being challenged and progressed around 8 weeks. Muscle power, really important, can take about 12 weeks. Endurance is a bit longer, 26 weeks. Improvements in gait, about 8 weeks. And then bone strength takes longer, so about a year. But again, with bone strength, the intensity of the stress has to be enough. And what's being found is walking isn't enough. It needs to be more than that. Decent heavy weight training can do it, and it's a higher impact activity. And so often for older people, you'll hear people say, we'll do some gentle exercises with you. And what does that mean? You know, it needs to be specific, and it needs to overload the muscle, and it needs to be progressive. Otherwise, it's not going to make a difference. Next slide, please. All right, a word on walking aids, ageism, the bane of my life for a lot of my career. So walking aids. In my experience clinically, people tend to just give older people walking aids just because it's a quick fix and it sorts them out. And it's fine to give people walking aids, but actually what you've got to do is also tackle the underlying problem, which is probably some level of muscle weakness and some balance and gait problems that can be rehabbed, they can be treated. And so a stick will give somebody confidence, it'll increase the base of support. The benefit of a stick is it maintains a normal gait pattern. Yeah. What tends to happen, and this is what I've seen over and over and over again with older people, is they just get given a Zimmer frame, a walking frame, a rollator. And what that does do is it gives them a bit of confidence, it'll increase the base of support, and it will enable them to move about. But unless you do something to retrain their balance and strengthen them, they will lose their normal gait pattern. And it means that they're having to use an upper limb strategy. They're having to use the hands to balance. And that means they can't do other functions. And they're having to manoeuvre this cumbersome frame around. It alters their posture. So they tend to lean slightly forward to get onto the frame, which means the centre of gravity is forward, which means if you take that frame away, they'll feel like they're falling forward. And this is one of the reasons we not only try and impress people on the need to rehab older people properly, but just it made us think about, is there another way we can help people rehab? So that's, it's gentle seated exercise isn't enough, and think before you just give out a frame, or think of the rehab that you can do alongside that. Next slide, please. So neurological conditions. So in the rehab teams, obviously we saw a whole range of conditions and needed to rehab those. And so we, in effect, were specialist generalists, I suppose. And we know that the neuro conditions will affect balance and therefore risk of falling, and that will be due to altered sensory inputs, weakness, altered ranges of movement, the way that information is processed in the brain. So for example, stroke, MS, Parkinson's disease, and many more. So let's just have a next slide, and we'll look at motor learning, or motor relearning. Yay! Yeah. So I started looking at I found out about motor relearning when I did my master's, interestingly. And it's skill acquisition. It's how do we learn a skill and relearn a skill. And there's loads of evidence around this now about how we do it and how it should be and could be applied to people who've got neural conditions. And the beauty of this is it starts to empower the person. They don't have to rely on a therapist to come and do things to them. It gives them some control of their condition. So Dams et al., and this is a recent paper, they identified that sort of the complex movements we do actually consist of sequences of smaller component movements. And if you think about walking, that, you know, it's exactly that. You've got to shift your weight from one foot to the other, swing one leg forward. And actually, if you've had a neuro type condition or problem, for example, a stroke, you've got to relearn some of these smaller sequences before you can then put it into the whole sequence. And that requires some of those sequences to be learned in terms of the spatial sequence, so the order that these sequences come in terms of the time and where in space, but also then the motor element of that, so the speed of movement, the force that's required, the angle of joint ranges. Now these are sometimes called the critical components of a movement that need to be relearned. So there'd be critical components of reach and grasp, for example. There's critical components of sit to stand that get you to move to the front of the chair. You need to get your weight forward, centre of mass forward, because it's a big movement that you're going to do, and you're going to come forward and up, and it's the hip extensors that are having to work. And you might have to kind of practice elements of that. So part practice of elements and then put it into the whole part whole. And, you know, people won't get that perfect first time round. It's like anything, you've got to learn it and practice it and practice it. The key to gaining a skill is practice, and it is also making mistakes and then trying to refine that movement. And just a word on walking. So one of the critical components of walking is this ability to shift weight laterally, side to side, and shift your weight so you're actually on one leg to allow you to swing the other leg forward. And there's a lot of evidence with stroke showing that this side to side transfer, if that is trained properly, it can be effective at improving balance and gait speed. And that again links to us trying to devise a piece of equipment that might actually enable you to do this safely without multiple therapists
and massive kit
and massive pieces of kit like big tracking hoists or what have you. So yeah, next slide please. So challenges of treating balance. So we're probably both going to have a little word on this one, because we may both have some slightly different experiences. But what we found, or certainly what I found, is therapists are incredibly pragmatic and they're quite problem solving and will use whatever they can use in a pragmatic way to enable that patient to achieve something, usually to achieve standing. And what I've noted is that people often use moving and handled equipment to provide a means of getting somebody on the feet so they can do some rehab. Now, the problem with that is it's really passive. It often relies on them being able to cling on to something and pull themselves up. The knee blocks on these things are often quite extensive and come around the sides, so they kind of prevent a normal standing position, and they don't allow weight shifting, so they don't allow that training of that lateral movement. Parallel bars are reasonable, but they rely on an upper limb strategy, so they rely on you being able to hold on, and you might need loads of therapists to do that. And then obviously, you know, my experience is that in ward settings particularly, people will stick a walking frame in front of an older person to help them to practice standing up. And they're straight into that upper limb strategy, and so it's limiting their overall function.
And I think just to add to that, I think one of the other sort of the challenges, apart from obviously suboptimal equipment, is suboptimal staffing. And so if we're thinking about opportunities and intensity of treatment and frequency of treatment, we needed to think of a way that we could optimize that. So could we get a piece of kit that meant people could be in a functional position as regularly as possible? And so would that be something that could be carried over by nurses? Could it be carried over by non-registered staff in care homes? Could it be done by family members? So that every day, every contact can count. So from being a passive activity, it becomes an active activity. And that goes over into the next slide, actually. And if we can just have the next slide, Cora, please. Lovely. If we think about the challenges of staffing in an acute setting, magnify it into a community setting, when we start to put into the equation travelling time, when we start to put into the equation that you might need 2 people travelling in different directions. And if you think about the limitations of someone's front room or bedroom, you know, you're lucky if there's a couch that you can take the cushions off and it just happens to fit where the knees are and you can get them stood up with a bit of anterior knee support. But to be fair, what's the use of looking at a wall at the back of a sofa? You know, it's, again, it might be better positionally, and if we're thinking about critical components, it might facilitate critical components, but what's the functional gain of that as well? And so what basically, from what Rachel said, in terms of older people, in terms of people affected with neurological conditions, we wanted to get a piece of kit that was portable, with an adjustable knee block that could facilitate active standing and balance training. So if we can have the next slide, and then we can show you, ta-da! 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 Okay. Now, we'll just talk you really quickly through this Balance Active, because this didn't just appear one night at the end of the, you know, at the end of the drive. This has been blood, sweat and tears. But if we tell you what it's primarily consisted of, and then we'll tell you the journey to its fruition. Okay, so it's lightweight, it's portable, it comes to pieces. There's a base plate that's got a non-slip base, and it's got some adjustable feet on there. So you can take those off to put them up to counters or into bathrooms or kitchens to do some functional practice, obviously after assessment. The knee block is adjustable, so we've gone through normal anthropometric measurements, and that represents most of the adult population in terms of height, and the weight limit is, remind me, 100 kilograms.
100 kilograms.
Okay, so it does take up quite a size. It'll take quite a sizable service user, but it's only 15 kilograms itself when it's in its bag to carry. So you 10. Sorry,
10?
yes, it's
10
yes,
kilograms.
it is. You're quite right. So that's one of its selling points. So anyway, so it's 10 kilograms when it's in pieces, and it can go into a bag. So that's it as it is now. But we'll talk to you about the journey, because this is the thing that we want to encourage you as therapists or health and social care workers to explore. Because if you've got that idea and you talk to enough patients about what could be better, then it's a brilliant chance, you know, to hopefully to inspire you to have a bash yourselves. So let the journey commence. Can we have the next slide? So how did we do it? It was an initial sketch on a piece of paper. And so we discussed and clinically reasoned why we thought that and actually it was after a motor relearning course that we really got our heads together. We'd been on the weekend and had those patients up in gym, and we'd been using up and down plinths and seeing how good that was. And we thought, what could we
do better than this?
What could we do that would do the same thing as an up and down plinth, but you don't need an up and down plinth to do it?
So you don't need a clinic.
You don't need a clinic, exactly, and you don't need 1,500 quid for one. But also, you know, we had to sort of translate that into being safe. And in the first instance, we went to an all singing, all dancing marketing company who did the most beautiful boards and did give us a gorgeous prototype, and it was lovely and it looked fabulous, but it didn't work. So we were like, oh, heck, you know, that's a bit of a bugger. So we went then and reflected, which is what we're good at that. And we went on to the next phase of our journey, which is the next slide. So it didn't meet our needs. It certainly wouldn't have been safe, although it was quite lovely to look at. Could have been possibly something that you might see in an art gallery. Anyway, because of our experience in community rehabilitation, we had got connections with a company called Remap. And for anybody who's working with people with disabilities and wants something bespoke, these guys are absolutely fantastic. It's free. A lot of the people that work in Remap are ex-engineers, retired people, and want to give something back. And they are absolutely superb. And they developed as the second prototype drawing. So that then led us to linking with another a charity called Demand. And again, they're free, but they do like to have a donation made, which obviously is critically important for them to keep going. And they made us prototype 2. Now, this worked, but it wasn't pretty. And also, it now needed to be stress tested. So in our work, you know, in our heads, we're like, well, it works.
It works.
Why can't we just do it? But obviously, we realised that it needed to be, as a medical device, it needed to be CE marked. So this then sent us off on our next bit of the journey. So if we can go to our next slide, please. We had a serendipitous introduction to the University of Sheffield. And sometimes, you know, things happen for reasons. And from having our Heath Robinson to our beautiful finished shiny product, we wouldn't have known that we'd be linking in with these 3 fabulous newly qualified graduates who'd set up their own business. So we were keen to support them, and Rachel and I had got a track record with Calderdale Framework in taking an idea from paper to a product, to an evidence-based product. So we had got that experience, but we hadn't got the engineering experience, and we didn't have a clue how long that would take. Now, in amongst all this, we had to explore the I almost want to say treacherous landscape of intellectual property, but it's, you know, you've got to, don't be naive, make sure that you've got things, you know, you need non-disclosure agreements when you're having conversations with people. You need to make sure you
protect your design.
Your designs. We went and spoke to all sorts of companies, people like Siddle, people like
Demand,
Devil Bliss, massive companies, and you know, you don't want them to pinch your passion. Ultimately they can pinch it, but they've got to pay for it. But in the meantime, we had to get it absolutely, we'd got proof of concept, if you like, and then we needed to get to the point where we could try it with and make it safe with service users. So it was a 4-year process. And then they developed the prototype, which is now modular, manufacture ready, fatigue tested, CE marked as a classic 1 medical device, and it's now on the Master Indemnity Register. We're approved suppliers for the NHS. And that, again, is another bit of a minefield, because you need to make sure you've got all your insurances there. So I think one day we want to write this as a paper, really, about
a book.
Yeah, possibly it might be the epitaph. But anyway, it is a process that you learn tons along the way about, and we obviously want to share that with you. So we've gone from a back of a beer mat now to a piece of equipment that's manufacture ready, it's CE marked, and it's we're approved as an NHS supplier. So you think you're there, don't you? Next slide, please. Get into market. So, vertical learning trajectory, or what? This is incredible. So I think we did learn that it took us 10 years from evidence into practice with the Calderdale framework. So we are quite, tenacious and patient. But I think we thought once this piece of kit were ready, then everybody would want it, but nobody even knew what it was. So this is about when you've got to think about how you're going to launch it, who's your target audience, how we're going to reach the audiences. Massive amount of work. And so we are fortunate this month we've got an article in Frontline, which is a physiotherapy magazine. We launched at the CSP conference in 2019, and we also attended Therapy Expo last year as well. But then obviously with COVID, things again, another challenge. So we did our first virtual conference, which very interesting to actually create a virtual stand, to network in a virtual lobby, so really lots and lots of learning from us. But important that you've got to be able to access and get in touch with these key stakeholders and getting patients to try it. Again, in COVID, it's been really interesting, but obviously we don't want to steal the thunder from next week's conversation because that's next week's treats. And then navigating procurement. You'll be glad to know, though, there is a way around it. And again, we'll talk to you about that later down through the 4 weeks. But, think of it as an opportunity to learn. The stuff that you can learn doing this is absolutely phenomenal. And if we do it again, or when we do it again, if we've got enough years left, I don't know, maybe our experiences, maybe I've got time. Oh God! So if anybody wants to pick up an idea, let us know. But no, it does take you more than you think. Anyway, next slide, please. So who are using it now? Who is using Balance Active as literally not this very second, but which sort of settings? Well, care homes. I think you'll all be absolutely mindful that with COVID, getting in to see face-to-face for face-to-face interventions is really, really tricky. Now, we've been really lucky. We've got a fabulous care home in Bradford that just before lockdown, we trained their activity coordinators in the use of Balance Active, and they've been able to, well, they've just run with it, and it's been fantastic. And actually, an edict came out about reducing the risk of deconditioning during COVID, and we're going to be using the case studies from the care home that we'll talk to you next week as a partial solution towards that. Private physios have reported some fabulous results, and they've been using these with patients that are like post 7 years clipped aneurysms. People have become really weak, lost the confidence. You know, one of the guys is now back on stairs. It's just awesome. We're doing a trial from next week with an acute trust, so we'll keep you posted on that, and that's why we're so pleased we've got 4 weeks to share some stories as literally as they evolve. And then personal trainers, you know, these guys have got an amazing part to play in making sure that we can keep our communities in good condition. And again, for people with some long-term conditions, it's giving people a choice about how they self-manage. And so those are sort of some flavours, and that's, as we say, we'll build on those next week when we talk to you about the case studies. So if you can just give us the next slide, and then I think we're going to be having some questions. So I think we just want to share the lessons. Like we said, time consuming and steps to sales take longer than you would ever imagine. Okay, it's costly. The development, the production, the marketing, the trials. I mean, last week we had another invoice sent because they needed to do some flammability tests. It's like, who's going to set fire to it? Oh, dog. Who's going to set fire to it? But, you know, we've got to take into account these might be in people's houses. If someone drops a cigarette on it, you've got to cover every eventuality. And last but not least is keep positive and remember why you started it. You know, we did this out of patient need.
It
to
was
try
to
and make
improve
patients' experiences. And therapists, because circling round looking after an unstable knee in a pair of parallel bars is quite hard. So that's a frolic through, a reminder about the physiology, if you like, the demand for it, and why and how we got to where we are. So I would like to pass back to Caro and see if there's any questions.
Okay, so I'll just turn my camera back on, and Chris is coming there. I'm just going to stop sharing. We'll get back together again. Well, thank you so much. That was just really informative and really interesting. Good. It was absolutely lovely. So
wanted it to be interesting.
Good. Yeah. Well, we have got some questions. We've got lots of questions actually. So I'm going to just start. We're going to go back to the. Oh, sorry. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to take you back to the very beginning of your presentation. Sorry, because I'm going to move the questions through your presentation. So the first question that we had was about just not people not notifying about being notified about falls. So the question that I had was, you mentioned falls were not reported. So who doesn't report the falls? Is that the person who's had the fall? Is that the family, the nursing homes? Who's not reporting them?
I think it's the person who's had the fall. They often don't report that they've fallen.
For example,
or the family doesn't always report. So if they don't perceive that they've actually got a severe injury, you know, like a fracture or a head injury or something, they often they don't report the fall. I think the problem is people still think falling is part of normal aging, and that you know, I'm old, so I'm going to fall, and it's trying to get the message across that actually falling is not normal aging.
Report it, and then something can be done about it. And so it's encouraging people to talk about it.
And is that something that is sort of common with therapists, is that sort of that they're not necessarily encouraging people to think about falls as something which isn't part of the aging process?
We tend to see people once they've fallen a few times, or there's a consequence of the fall, there's injury, you know, there's injury because of the fall, and it's getting that message out to people earlier, sooner. You know, it's part of that prevention. You know, it's part of our prevention strategies, really, is to get the fact out, like Rachel said, falling is not normal. So if you are falling, report it.
And I think things like there are fall services and things are improving, but people are still falling. And so somewhere along the line, people are accruing these risk factors that make them more likely to fall. And some of it is public health, isn't it? Some of it's about engaging people in not being sedentary, for example, and being active and taking up things that will keep them active. So it probably starts in middle age or even before that, and a push to try and keep people moving and active.
Okay, so that brings us on to sort of Balance Active, and how Balance Active is really supporting patients with their confidence, because one of the things you talked about was how falls can really impact people's confidence and their well-being. So what's the evidence that you've got so far of how Balance Active is actually supporting people's growing and their growing confidence?
It's the evidence we've got is real world evidence. So we've not got research studies from lab type settings. We've got real world evidence from patient reports, so people who've actually used it, and the therapists who've used it with patients who overwhelmingly say actually they feel more confident with it. They feel they can do more things with the patient.
If you have a look on the website, there are a few potted case studies. Obviously we want to explore those with you in more detail over the next 3 weeks, but the confidence has been a common theme throughout, hasn't it? So there's been other benefits, but they've felt more willing to go out of the base of support. They've felt more willing to be on the feet, you know, and so and that confidence is massive. Like Rachel said, emotion and arousal, fear of falling is another risk factor. So once you can get people up on them feet confidently, you have a chance.
And feeling that they're not just going to collapse in a heap. The knees, you know, the knees can't go. And I think what's really interesting from some of the real world case studies is some of the people who've used Balance Active are far frailer than we ever envisaged would use it, which is quite interesting. And you know, even at that extreme end of the spectrum, they have found it helpful, and it's given them more confidence to achieve some of the things they actually want to do, which is really important. It's about enabling people to do what they want to do.
It's incredibly person-centred. It does offer that opportunity to be able to, I mean, and like we mentioned, you know, putting it into an activity coordinator role rather than medicalising it, it's making it fun, you know. So one of the ladies stands and she's been doing, maybe it sounds trivial to you, right? But she's standing in the care home and folding napkins. This is a demented lady. She's so much calmer. She's happy. She's up on her feet, and she's actually, her gait's improved.
And she's better on her feet.
Absolutely. So she's doing something, she's occupied, so she's less agitated and she's strengthening. So it's lovely, really.
It is.
Oh, so another question I've got is the piece of equipment, is Balance Active being used on stroke units, to your knowledge?
It's not used on stroke units yet, and that's because stroke units don't know about it yet.
It could be used on
stroke units, absolutely. And so, you know, this is one of the challenges. It's about anything that's new, because you know, this is not to be super critical, but we can't always look at the randomized control trial that compares an outcome using Balance Active and not using Balance Active on a stroke unit, because if we wait for that to happen, we're going to have to create that and do those studies. So we would be absolutely delighted if someone wants to do that. But as you know, like we're saying, we're able to articulate real world evidence and case studies at the moment. But if there's anybody who wants to do more, you know, more studies, feel free to contact us. We'd be absolutely thrilled.
But it has been used, as Jane was saying when she was explaining about the journey we went on. It is being used by a private neurophysio service
in Sheffield,
and they've used it on a range of people who've had various neurological conditions
with good effect. Right. And I mean, and if you're thinking about discharge to assess and early discharge models, this could potentially be incredibly helpful in terms of, we're talking about reducing the need for 2 pairs of hands and optimising opportunities to practice. You know, I think we need to think, yes, obviously about stroke units, but we need to think more and more about how we get people treated in community
and at home.
You know, that's
and empower them to take some control of their own self-management.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a self-management enabler,
it's powerful.
Yeah, it is.
I've got another question here. Do you find that sensation is not accurately or adequately tested in a multifactorial assessment of falls history or neuroassessment?
That what? Sorry, I didn't hear the.
Do you find that the sensation is not accurately or adequately tested in a multifactorial assessment of falls history?
It's often not tested.
And it's interesting.
It's often not, because you could do two-point discrimination at the feet, for example.
Exactly.
Sorry, that together.
Stereo.
And that tends not to be done.
And the vibration tests.
Vibration tests don't often get done. And I mean, gross things like you may test what somebody's balance is like, eyes open, eyes closed. That often does get done, but the more precise things often don't.
And actually, interestingly, we were chatting with somebody who's developed a surface around 2-point discrimination, and thinking about how you could put that onto shoes or onto balance active to give them that extra, stimulation, really. So there's room for improvement. In our experience.
There's also got a question about your sort of the design of balance active, and just about your sort of thinking behind the actual design and the shape of it. So just some thoughts about it from an anatomical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, it's got the base plate that you stand on to counterbalance,
and that means the thing can't move.
Yeah. So that's the first thing. You don't have to depend on it. It can be on a non-slip surface anywhere, because the body weight itself is going to be the thing that gives you the resistance. The positioning of the knee is just beneath your patella. So in terms of being able to get tibial advancement and correct positioning of your ankle and your knees and your hips over each other, like Rachel was saying about critical components, then you've got it, and it facilitates critical components and the recruitment of the anti-gravity muscles.
So what we've found when somebody's standing on it is that your glutes and your trunk extensors really work.
They really kick in, because people aren't in a flexed position. They're not hyperextended, hanging backwards. They are actually recruiting the muscles exactly. Yeah. And so if we go back to proprioception, they're going to get the accurate sensory input, as well as from the joint positioning, as well as obviously the opportunity to put the joints through the full range as well.
And the little grab handles were designed so that somebody could light touch them. So they're not really designed to cling hold of.
No.
It's there as a light touch if somebody feels unstable.
Which is like tandem supported standing and things like that.
Brilliant. We've got a question that's come up a few times. How much is it?
Well, what we've tried to do is to make this affordable, because it's low tech. We want it out there in as many places as possible. We've kept it under £400, so it's £395 plus VAT. And that's been really key for us to make sure that it is affordable. It's no good having all this high fancy polluting kit if no one can afford to use it. And so, I think we are altruistic. We obviously have got we've spent a lot of money developing this, but we developed it to be used, not for a big ego trip. So, we want to get these out there, which is why we've done it at that price point.
Thank you. I've got another question. Do you have any tips and guidance in assessment of balance in virtual situations?
Funnily enough, we're just developing those. So that might be something we could discuss in week 3, because that would be quite nice to share with the remote rehab communities in terms of like objective markers and subjective markers. It'd be really good to get some commonality and translate. Look at how you would do a face-to-face falls assessment and see how much of that you could turn into remote. So that might be a piece of work as a joint development.
But balance active might
it would
that,
exactly
make that facilitate that,
because to get someone on the feet remotely when you're not there is a bit scary. So it's about how could this be an adjunct to that. And again, going back to this notion of discharge to assess, these are things we're going to have to be. It's about risk taking, but informed risk taking. Absolutely. And risk is risky, and we can't get rid of all of it, but we can manage it as far as is practicable.
And we are designed to move.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not designed to sit. It's bad.
Yeah.
Sedentary is not good.
No, that's not the answer.
No.
Don't move them.
No. No.
Don't move them, no.
Please don't do that.
We've also got a question about the response from family members. And so how it in Balance Active, when you've got Balance Active in the home, how have family members been responding to it, or carers and support people?
Certainly from the neuro service, they've tended to identify a place in the home where that Balance Active is probably best placed for the patient, but also for the family. And they have that negotiation with them. And then the feedback from the carers actually has been really positive, largely because they have seen the improvement in their loved ones, I suppose, from having used it.
And again, sorry, I don't want to use all our little snippets for whatever, but there's one young man now who he can stand at the microwave now and warm a meal up and do jacket potatoes ready for the family to come home. You know, and the mum reporting on that as
the mum was beside herself with
joy
really,
because
it improved so much.
And he couldn't do that on a perch stool because he couldn't reach it, and he couldn't do it from his wheelchair, and he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be on his feet. And so in terms of there's negotiation. It's like any equipment. If you're going to put it in somebody's house, if it's going to be there for them to use unsupervised, then it needs to be in a place that's as non-disruptive as possible. And if it's going to be something that's part of practice, then there's a strategy to enable that piece of kit to be put there to facilitate that practice. So it's only like anything else. You know, I don't think anybody's thrilled when they get a raised toilet seat or a powered bath lift, but if it can facilitate a positive outcome, hopefully with negotiation, again, sensitive negotiation with families, people can accommodate it.
You've also got a couple of questions about the sort of trialling of Balance Active. So you've got some people who are interested in actually trialling it. So we can just, that's again, is just to contact you directly.
Yes, please. Would be delighted.
That'd be great.
Absolutely delighted. As many people trying it as possible, because the more we can learn from it, we can start to get some best practice guidelines together.
Yeah.
And so we can do indications for older people, indications for neurologically impaired people. We don't want to take people's clinical reasoning skills away from them, but we want them to think about this as another piece of another tool in their kit. And unless they've had a play with it, they're not going to know what to do with it or what the potential is to do with it. So we'd welcome that.
Lovely. And our final question, because I'm really aware that we're sort of just clicking up to the sort of the hour time, is just on in terms of, have you had any patients who have been buying it themselves as their own piece of kit for their own use?
Yes.
On the advice of their therapist.
Yeah.
Okay. And is there any kind of funding that patients can access to buy the kit and equipment? Is there anything you've done around funding?
We don't know about that yet, but back in the day of the community rehab teams, you used to be able to go to, I mean, I suppose it'd be now the STP, wouldn't it? And look and see if there's any funding for individual pieces of kit. But it might be something that they could discuss with their STP.
I don't know if the charitable bodies like the Stroke Association, I don't know if they have funding for people.
It does feel a bit like, you know, when the L'Oreal people say 80% of 37 women who tried this cream said it worked. It's almost like that, but the numbers are small yet, and this is why we think this relationship with the remote rehab community is awesome, because this is about sharing what works, learning from what doesn't, and developing it.
Yeah.
So, you know, this notion of trials is fabulous, and feedback and
great.
Absolutely.
Oh, brilliant.
Thank you so much. I just want
we did it.
We did it. And I just want to say that the link for your website is in chat. So before we sign out, everybody, before you go, if you look in chat, you'll see the link to the calderdaleframework.com. and also the links to our events and our community. So it'd be lovely to see some of you join our community. That would be wonderful. Remember, you get a month's free trial, and we'd love to see you in there. So thank you, Jayne and Rachael. That's been really wonderful.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been
enjoyed it. Thank
brilliant.
You.
Thank you.
We're looking
forward
to
see you
seeing
next.
you.
We'll see you next week.
See you in a week. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who was here. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.